let's talk about taking over a property with leases. Number one, I think it focuses on the future. When you have leases in place, you're better able to plan out events. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we go to our 12-unit building and all of our tenants have leases in place. We could say that because our tenants are paying $650 in a $750 market, by the time their lease expires, we could implement a new rent increase. Now, it may not be the $100, but it might be $30 per month. It might be $35 per month. But we could stage that as to be implemented when all of those leases are expiring. So you can really plan for the next 12 months when you can do your rent raises. From those rent raises and your expense reductions, you can kind of build what your budget is going to be, let's say, for the rest of 2012 and into 2013. So I think taking over a property with leases allows you to plan and focus on the future. Now, when you buy a property and you have 12 tenants there and they do have leases in place, you, the new owner of the new property management company, you have to adhere to the lease that's in place. You can't just close on that today and implement your new lease when that tenant is under contract already. You've got to wait till that lease expires, then you can give them your lease, unless there's language in the lease that says differently, okay? So you've got to wait till that lease expires. Marco, question?
Yeah, what if you find a problem on the existing lease? Like, let's say there is no termination date on the existing lease. How you approach that?
Yeah, so his question is, what if you find a problem with the lease and you don't like it? That's why due diligence is so important, number one. But number two, the owner could change some things. Number one, take that opportunity as a chance for negotiation. The price, the terms, or hey, you have to change these leases and put an expiration date on prior to us closing on this deal. So you give them a few different options. Maybe the latter couldn't be done, but you might want to ask for terms like a credit at closing because of that. So if they give you a credit at closing, that allows you to bring less money to closing, less down payment, easier on you. Take that opportunity and use it in your negotiations.
Yeah, but if you have a problem like the termination date, is there a time limit where you can actually implement that? Or this lease is going to go on and on and on?
That's my point. Without a termination date, the lease will go on and on and on. So if you find that in your due diligence, that's when you need to negotiate with the seller to either get that changed. If for some reason he doesn't change that, you're going to have to ask for a credit.
Okay, with the seller, not the tenant.
With the seller.
Yep.
Yep, with the seller. Now, when you take a property over with leases and they have a lease in place and you don't like their lease and their lease expires, you can take your lease and put it in place then. But when you're taking over a property, you have to leave that lease that they have alone. You can't change it, you can't adapt it or amend it, things like that, okay? So yes, he pointed out, if you're taking over a property with leases and they have no expiration date, that's a problem. You got a little bit of a challenge there, so you're going to have to negotiate that, okay? Yes?
In several cities, I don't know if it's across the country, but even in the example we used this morning, a lot of us were talking about taking the tenants out to do the renovations. And I know that in Ontario there's laws where you can't just kick them out.
Right. You can't just, they have a contract, you can't kick them out here either.
I'm not saying even with lease, if it's a 60-day, you know, if it's no lease and it's a 60-day, but you want to renovate units, is that a big thing in the States as well, where you can't just get rid of them?
If they have a lease in place, you can't get rid of them. You have to wait till that lease is up. If their lease is up, you just need to send, that's all that you were required to adhere to is that contract, and let's just say it's up March 31st of 2012, you're not required to give them any notice beyond that. You're just not renewing their lease. Now, Would it be smart to give them a notice out of courtesy? Sure. I think if you were planning on doing renovation, I would probably be telling them in January that you're not renewing their lease due to renovations that's going to happen, but, you know, that would be me. Okay? There's no laws because you've got a lease in place. That lease expires the 31st of March. You have no other obligation after that. Okay? Good question. I think even when you're taking over a property with leases, a lot of times what will happen is because a property is being sold, sometimes the owner of that property or the property manager doesn't really focus on good property management activities, so they slack a little bit in collecting rents and monitoring its expenses and things like that. So I really think it's an opportunity to get back to even their lease, read it, and reinforce that lease even for the rest of its term. It might only be in effect for another 3 or 4 months, but really take that opportunity to reinforce that lease and the rules at least that are a part of that lease. Okay? The other thing that I think is important for you to do is still consider this an opportunity for creative financing. So, for instance, when you're reviewing those leases and you notice that, 8 out of the 12 leases are set to expire in the next 60 days, utilize that to go back to the seller and renegotiate again. I think that is an important thing that you could implement. Let's talk about raising rents and how that's important and why that's important. Now, the first thing that I think is important for you to do, and it's the last point on my slide here, is to use market rents. If you're a property manager or your property management company that you're selecting, you need to make sure that they're understanding what the rents are for your competition in that marketplace. They should be doing a market rent survey periodically, every 4 months, every 2 months, every 6 months, but they should know what is being charged by your competitors. Now, once you have that market rent established, you can take a look at what your rent is on your property. If your property is significantly below market rents, you should have a plan to start doing a rental increase. Now, if you're doing a rental increase, typically that's done at lease turnover. The tenants have a lease in place. You can't raise their rent during the term of their lease unless there's specific language in the lease that you can do so. So you're going to do that at lease turnover. Now, the other thing that to bear in mind is if your subject property is, let's say, $50 below market rent, your tenant base may not be able to absorb a $50 increase per month in their rent. They might be able to absorb a $25 rental increase, but not a $50. So, in analyzing that scenario, you may be looking at raising rents over a 2-year period. And that's kind of the planning and strategy that you should be communicating with your property management company. Sitting down at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the relationship and talking about things like this. I also think that you should be looking at things like turnover history. You should be looking at things like occupancy rate. If you've got a high turnover history there, chances are something's up with that. If you've got low tenant retention, especially less than a year, bad management, you could have things like rodents, all kinds of issues could cause those tenants not to stay for a long time. Or it could be your tenant base in general. So those are the things that you're going to want to communicate. All right?